attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the April Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss IT policy and how it can help address IT security issues. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the president of Community IT. As always, we encourage you to interact with us by asking questions via the GoToWebinar chat feature. You can also connect with us on Twitter, and we can be followed at Community IT. And you can also follow me at HammerstromJ. We won't be tweeting throughout the webinar today, and I'll also be holding all questions until the end of the webinar, but we do encourage you to ask questions as the webinar goes along. Just a reminder to avoid multitasking during the webinar. You may just miss the best part. If you do miss the best part or need to leave the webinar early, we'll be posting links to the recording and slides on our website. In case you aren't familiar with Community IT, just to tell you a little bit about who we are, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their mission through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community. We've served over 900 nonprofits since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and cultures of nonprofit organizations. Wanted to let you all know that I'm flying solo today and will, as I mentioned before, be answering all questions at the end of the webinar. And I also have a list of questions submitted during the registration process that I'll try to address through the webinar as well as at the end of the presentation. So good afternoon, glad you could all join us. And I also wanted to let you know that today's webinar is actually based on a presentation that I led with Legal Services Corporation CIO Peter Campbell at the recent Nonprofit Technology Conference in Austin, Texas. And so this is a revamp of that presentation. And today we're going to be addressing the following topics. I want to talk a little bit about the IT threat landscape in 2015 as something that has changed dramatically in the last few years. Also want to look a little bit at the CIA security framework as a way of addressing the new security landscape, and then shift to a conversation of security as IT policy, and finally talk a little bit about the IT policy guidelines. If you'll bear with me for just a second. Great. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned before, 2014 actually, and 2013 to some extent was a record year for IT breaches, for security breaches, and I want to talk a little bit about them here for a few minutes, just because it gives you a good sense of the different kinds of problems and challenges that we're facing now as we try to manage threats to our networks. And many of these examples come from much larger organizations, but as we often see in the world of IT, the problems and challenges that larger organizations face today will likely be the problems and challenges faced by smaller organizations over the next few years. So most of you are probably familiar with the Target and Home Depot breaches. The Target breach is a particularly interesting example, not only because it was probably one of the most well-known, it was one of the first sort of massive security breaches in which I believe hundreds of millions of credit card information was stolen and resulted in a lot of people getting reissued credit cards, myself included. But what also made the Target breach interesting was the fact that it was not the entry point was through a third-party provider. It was the HVAC contractor who was managing Target's HVAC systems against PCI compliance. They had access through their network access to the HVAC system, to the credit card system as well. The other thing that makes that breach notable is the fact that there was a very advanced, sophisticated security intrusion detection system called FireEye, which was in place and was actually alerting Target to the problem. But unfortunately, the person whose responsibility it was to respond to that was not there. There was no position that was filled to respond to those alerts, and so it went unnoticed and undetected until the FBI uh, figured it out and came talking to Target. There was the celebrity iCloud hack, which some of you might be familiar with, in which a number of celebrities' iCloud accounts were hacked into, and compromising photos were obtained and then distributed through the internet. And this was an interesting breach because it sort of reflected the extent to which, the technology has become very personal, and if you're not careful in how you set it up, you may think that it's secure and that you're protected, but if you don't take the necessary precautions, um, that may not be the case. Sony Pictures, many of you may remember around the time that the interview was going to be released, Sony Pictures had um, a massive breach in which a huge amount of their data was stolen and was sort of slowly leaked in the days leading up to the intended release of the movie The Interview. This was thought to be an inside job just because of the amount of data that was stolen and the extent to which the hackers sort of knew their way around the Sony Pictures information systems. Unfortunately, it led to a number of movies that Sony had not yet released were released in pirated version online, and it was a massive problem for Sony. Their entire IT infrastructure was shut down for a number of days while they tried to mitigate the damage from the intrusion. So that was a massive threat. Dark Hotel is one in which it's what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. There were some luxury hotels in London where people were executives from large corporations were staying, and basically someone had, hackers sort of found their way onto the wireless network, the hotel wireless network, pretended to be a valid, Adobe update download, tricked the executives into downloading it, and then had access to corporate data into their networks. Heartbleed, Sandworm, and Wirelooker are all vulnerabilities that were found on websites. Hold on a second. Somebody is saying that they're still seeing the intro slide. I think this is going, but if anybody else is having that problem, please let us know. But I think for most people, we should be seeing the full slides. Okay. So those were all vulnerabilities that needed to be patched. They were interesting because some of them had been around for a long time. So those were, but they led to the possibility of breaches. And then Superfish was one that was on the Lenovo laptops. So Lenovo was shipping laptops that had basically, it was adware that when people would do Google searches, it would pop up results for shopping or purchasing, things related to those searches. But unfortunately, it was easily hacked. Basically, the security certificate that was used was easily compromised, and anyone who had that knowledge could, easily, basically pull all the information off the laptop that they wanted to. So the point that I'm trying to make behind all of this is that the threat landscape, which in the past, particularly for smaller organizations, was focused around, malware and viruses, phishing attacks through email. Those that kind of attack and breach in the past has been replaced by something much more sophisticated and much more dangerous. And in many ways, as the IT landscape has changed, people who are behind these threats have taken opportunities to compromise that landscape. So some of the lessons learned would be one, that Firewalls only protect the data that stays behind them. And so you've probably often heard that a firewall is an important device to have to keep your network safe. And while this is true, um, it's also the case that data is no longer staying behind the firewall. And so if you have mobile devices that are being used at your organization, data is on them. If you have staff that are using Dropbox, the data is going out that way. People are now out in the cloud and logging in remotely to connect to the data. So the firewalls, while still very important, are no longer the end all be all of security in the way that they used to be. Passwords no longer as secure as we once thought they were, and I'll get into password policy a little bit later on in the presentation. But just having a secure password or any password at all is no longer sufficient to keeping hackers out. And the tools for hacking have become much, much easier to use. And as was the case with the iCloud, the celebrity iCloud hack, there are now sort of dark nets of hackers where someone who doesn't have any technical hacking skills can go, if they have a malicious intent, they can find someone with those skills and basically contract them to do the work. So the landscape has changed. There is now, as we see it over the next 5 years, a much greater need to emphasize and focus on security. That's what we're going to talk about today. So in the midst of all of these threats, what you really need is a security framework. We need some way of thinking about securing our networks that will allow us to adapt and respond to the new, universe of threats, if you will. It's no longer enough to say, well, I have a firewall or I have antivirus software, or, I have passwords. We really need to take a more holistic approach to responding to security. So the framework that I'm going to discuss today is called the CIA Security Framework. Doesn't come from the Central Intelligence Agency, despite the acronym. CIA stands for confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And I'm going to talk about what each one of those mean. But those three concepts are very important, and understanding what those concepts mean is very helpful in thinking about how to secure your network. So let's start with confidentiality. What does confidentiality refer to? It's basically talking about who has access to the data, who can read the data, and it's really about controlling access to the data. You want to make sure that the data remains confidential. And all of the CIA concepts are not binary. They're not all or nothing. Well, it's either confidential or not. There's degrees of confidentiality. And in any time you're trying to secure an IT system, you're really engaged in a kind of a risk assessment because you can invest. There's plenty of advanced systems out there that can protect your data, but the question becomes how much should you be investing in those systems, and how much what kind of system or what cost of system is worthwhile for you to invest in. Answering that question requires you to do a little bit of a risk analysis. So the risk associated with confidentiality is disclosure of information. What's the risk if a particular type of information at your organization is disclosed, if someone who shouldn't have access has access to it? And we like to keep things a little bit simple. You can certainly make it more complicated, but we just assign a low, moderate, and high risk. So low, obviously, disclosure of information would have a limited negative effect. There's certain types of information where if it gets out, it's not the end of the world. Moderate information that has a moderate confidentiality risk. You don't want it to get out. It could have a serious adverse effect, but it might not be the end of the world. High, if the information gets out, it could have a severe or catastrophic effect. And in this case, the target is a good example of a situation where it was a confidentiality threat. So Target had no idea that their network had been breached, and the hackers were basically just lurking on their point of sales systems and collecting credit card data. And so that was data that should not have gotten out. It's a confidentiality threat, and the end result was a severe catastrophic effect. The last I heard, Target had still not, there was kind of no end in sight for the cost of that breach. There was sort of the immediate cost. They had to pay a number of compliance penalties, but the bigger cost for them was certainly the association with their brand and the impact, the negative impact that it had on their brand. So that's confidentiality, the C in CIA. The I stands for integrity. So who can edit the data? Who has not access to read the data, but who has access to change the data? Now, again, like Target is a good example where the data wasn't actually changed. In fact, they were lurking as quietly as they could to collect as much data as they could. Um, but anyone who has suffered through a virus infection knows that a big part of what viruses do is destroy the data that you have on the computer. So viruses are a good example of an integrity risk or an integrity impact to the security of your information. So you want to make sure that the data is accurate. Um, this could also refer to something more subtle where the data gets modified in ways that are maybe not obvious right away, but create problems long term. One example might be a student information system at a school where you don't want students reading other students' grades, and that's a confidentiality threat. But you certainly don't want students changing their own grades, which is an integrity threat. So again, thinking about the accuracy of the data, you want to evaluate, your information according to the integrity risk, and it's the same low, moderate, high ranking, where modification or destruction of data would have a limited adverse effect if it's low risk, would have a moderate adverse effect for serious risk, and would have a high, severe or catastrophic effect for a high risk. Finally, let's talk about availability. And availability touches on something that we're probably also familiar with. Oftentimes we think of backups, or business continuity. Um, those are actually related to the availability, um, you know, arm, if you will, of the CIA framework. Is the data accessible? Do you have access to the data when you need it? And so the risk here is disruption of access to information. And so the Sony Pictures hack is interesting because it was compromising not only the confidentiality of the data, executive salaries, new releases were all released to the public, but it also um, it also was disrupting their access to information because they had to shut down their network for, I believe, a full week while they, dealt with the threat. And so information security, could also create major availability problems for the organization. And again, as you look at all of your information that you have at your organization, you want to evaluate it based on the risk associated with disrupting access to that information. And if this all seems a little abstract right now, don't worry. I'm going to get to a very concrete example in just a minute. But oftentimes, I think, in conversations that we have with nonprofit organizations, they often think, well, look, we're a small, very small group. We don't have enemies. No one would target us. We don't really need to worry about IT security. But the reality is, a lot of the viruses out there are indiscriminate, and they're just trying to find an open network. They're not really interested in who runs that network, and they may not be interested in stealing your data. But if a virus gets on your network and crypto locks all of your files so that you can't unlock them, then you've now suffered, now you no longer have access to that data. So that's an availability risk for the organization. And you also, in some cases can't ever get the data, which is an integrity risk. So once again, confidentiality, availability, security, these are all really important concepts when thinking about your data and your information. So with that in mind, it's really important as when you think about securing your data, you have to understand what your data is. Not all data is created equal. Not all data has the same value for your organization, and not all data, can be evaluated in the same way according to the CIA risk analysis that we've just talked about. So it's important to list out all of your data throughout the organization and then analyze it from those three CIA perspectives and assign to each group of data or of information a low, moderate, and high risk. So let's go through two examples here. First example, a PDF of a signed annual performance review. That's information. It's important information. That's an HR file, and that's something that is very important for the organization to keep on record. So, what about the confidentiality risk associated with an annual performance review? In this case, we're saying that there's a high risk associated with the confidentiality of that information. It needs to remain confidential. In many organizations, there may actually be regulatory issues around maintaining the confidentiality of HR records, such as annual performance reviews. So there's a high risk there. What about the integrity of this data? Data should not change. Oftentimes, annual performance reviews are needed in the case of, the termination of staff. It's important that record is maintained accurately and is not changed by the person affected by it. So you don't want an employee who got a low performance rating on their review coming in sort of after the fact and changing it to a high performance rating, or making other changes to the document. So the data shouldn't change, and the organization needs to have the utmost confidence that the file is not altered. In terms of availability, maybe it's not a highly available piece of information. Generally, the HR processes that are in place at the organization call for a 2 to 3 day turnaround if the document is requested. And so when you're thinking about how to secure this information, availability isn't as important as integrity or confidentiality. So that's one example. Let's talk about another example just for contrast. The accounting system. The accounting system in an organization. What about confidentiality? I'm not, now that I'm looking at this, I'm not sure why I limited it. If the confidentiality is limited to the finance department and the president, why is it moderate? It probably should be high risk to the financial information getting out. Although some organizations have, open book, a lot of nonprofits have to disclose at least senior staff salaries on their 990. So maybe, for that organization, it's not as big a deal to have the financial information completely confidential. It does need to maintain integrity. The data in this accounting system is being updated on a regular basis, and they need to be able to roll back the last 30 days activity, and they need to have an audit trail. Who changed what in the system? What changes were made? So the risk around integrity, loss of integrity in the financial system is very high. This is particularly true for organizations. For a lot of organizations, fall under a lot of regulatory compliance around their organizational finances, and so it's critical that that the system have high integrity. In terms of availability, and again, this is really going to vary from organization to organization. I know with some of the smaller organizations that we work with, maybe they have a bookkeeper who comes in once a week and works on QuickBooks and enters stuff in the general ledger. In those cases, maybe a couple days of downtime is acceptable. For other organizations, maybe providing financial information is a critical part of delivering their programs and achieving their mission. And so no downtime is really acceptable, or downtime has to be minimized as much as possible. So again, this is very much a business decision, and it certainly varies from organization to organization. So these are just two examples, but this is kind of pulling it all together. This is a very basic, and it doesn't need to be complicated, but this can help. Having just an inventory like this can really help provide a lot of guidance as you're thinking about how to secure your information systems. And so as you can see here, we've inventoried the sensitive and less sensitive data for a hypothetical client. So this client works with medical records. Obviously, medical records need to maintain high confidentiality. I'm sure there's HIPAA compliance regulations around that for this organization. They need to maintain high integrity. The information on those medical records should not be changing. And obviously, they need to maintain high availability. So that's a system, the medical record system, around which you need to have maximum security. And the organization knows, in this case, that it needs to invest as much as possible in securing the medical record system. Now we go down to donor contacts and the financial accounting package. And again, like in this case, maybe the confidentiality isn't as important. It kind of depends. Some organizations have very high profile donors, and confidentiality might be very high for that system. Other organizations maybe less so. The integrity obviously is a critical piece. If donor email addresses or phone numbers are being changed on a regular basis, that's not going to be good for the organization. Um, and it needs to be available, although again, maybe not as much as the medical records. So in this case, as you're looking at this, you can say, well, we need to invest a lot in securing our medical records, maybe not as much in the donor contact and financial system, maybe less so in the HR records, and even less so in the system that we use for managing our programs. And so this, having this inventory really helps guide decision making around what to invest in and how to build out the information system that's supporting the network. And that's what we want to get to next, which is security as IT policy. So now that we know sort of all of the information that the organization has, and now that we know, now that we've kind of mapped out the levels of risk based on the CIA framework, now we're in a good position to start putting together an actual IT policy to address it. So let's get a little philosophical here first. What is an IT policy? And I pulled this from the font of all knowledge, Wikipedia. IT policy is agreed upon system of principles to guide IT decision making and achieve certain IT outcomes. And it's written as a statement of intent, implemented as a procedure or protocol. That's a mouthful. I rephrased that a little bit in a way that made a little bit more sense to me. What's an IT policy or a policy in general? IT policy is a policy basically is an organization agreeing on decisions and outcomes related to some area of the organization's, life or business. In this case, IT security. So the organization agrees on certain decisions, and the CIA inventory itself is kind of a policy because the organization is agreeing that certain types of information, has higher risks, around confidentiality than other types of information. Um, and it's basically leading the organization to agree on sort of what the outcomes are related to securing its information. So that's the first part of the policy. It's really an agreement that the organization has around those sorts of decisions. And then it's an agreement that's documented in writing. And I can't emphasize that enough. It absolutely has to be in writing for a couple of reasons. One, it needs to be in writing for continuity's sake. So you have one IT director or CIO who's helping to kind of frame the IT policy. If it's all in their head and they leave, then the person who takes over for them has no idea like the value of the data to the organization, and you have to either lose all of that or you have to go through and rehash all of those discussions all over again. So continuity is an important reason to put it in writing. It also, and I think we've all experienced this, you come out of a meeting and it's kind of like Rashomon. Like everybody has a different understanding of what was said in the meeting and what was agreed upon. And it's not until you put it in writing that it's actually, that there's an objective statement related to what the outcome was in that meeting and what the final decision was for the organization. So can't tell you enough how important it is to put it in writing. I know a number of people, when they registered for the webinar, were asking about templates, and we can certainly provide links to those after the webinar. But honestly, there's no great sort of magic. All of the really good policies that I've seen for the organizations that we work with, and even for ourselves, are really just having this discussion and putting it in a simple Word document. You can have more complicated systems for tracking your policies, but it's really a matter of just sort of writing out the decisions that you've made as an organization in a bulleted list or in a more structured format. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the webinar. In terms of IT policy, and I want to kind of dispel a myth, like oftentimes when you think about IT policy, what people think about is acceptable use policy, which is generally a document that you find in the employee handbook. And while that is a part of IT policy, it's really a very small part of overall IT policy. And I actually want to talk about two different types of IT policy that I think every organization should focus on developing. The first is the policies that govern the work of the IT department. So IT department needs to have its own set of policies, just governing and describing what its objectives are and how it's going to work. The IT department policy informs both architecture and process. So, what kind of backup system should an organization invest in? That's a very important question. And it's a difficult question to answer. It should not be technology driven. So, we would not recommend having, the person who's in charge of IT for an organization sort of go out and look at a bunch of solutions and then pick the one who had the best salesperson or the one that they were able to get the best deal on. It really needs to start with that CIA inventory. The organization needs to tell the IT department, this is the value that our data has, and this is high risk, this is low risk. You need to find a solution that basically matches the level of risk that we're willing or able to take on for the different kinds of information that we have. And so those are really architectural questions. So ultimately, the organization needs to kind of provide to the IT department the business requirements, in other words, and then the IT department can take those business requirements and turn them into technology solutions. And that's not I made it sound really simple just now, like, business requirements go in, you crank the wheel and boom, technology solution comes out. It's much more of a collaborative process. There needs to be a dialogue between the IT department and the rest of the organization. But again, at the end of that dialogue, at the end of that collaboration, what you end up with is a set of agreements, around the decisions that are being made. And then those need to be written down. And that's the policy. And so that can really guide both the architecture, the structure of the network, as well as the processes that the IT department follows to provide support, for the organization. For example, um, access management is a critical process. Can anyone in the organization request access to anyone else's files? What if the COO comes to the IT department and asks for access to the CFO's files? The director of operations asks for access to the director of finance's files. Is that approvable? How does the IT department know whether that's a valid request or not? That's a process issue. That needs to be documented in the IT department policy. And that relates to the confidentiality, sort of leg of the CIA triad. So this is all important. As you're thinking about putting together the IT policy for your IT department, and for smaller organizations, the IT department may be, one accidental techie who's wearing that hat part time. Still important to have those guidelines in place. It may be something that you're outsourcing to some extent. Even more important to have those guidelines in place. We like nothing better than coming into working with a new organization that already has a lot of this stuff laid out and can really provide guidance for us. It really makes the process of supporting the organization a lot easier. So whether you have a full-time IT department, whether your IT department is in air quotes and is an accidental techie, or a combination of an in-house person and a firm that you're working with, having policy really helps. Policy should include identity and access management. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but that really refers to authentication, like logging into the system and accessing information. It should talk about endpoint management. So what are you going to do to manage devices? And it should definitely talk about data retention. How long are you retaining your data? So here's some applying confidentiality, some other things to think about as you're sort of applying confidentiality more broadly to the IT department policy. It's important to segregate data based on the inventory. We've even gone so far as to put medical records on a completely separate network that cannot be accessed from the wireless network that the rest of the organization uses to, you know, to access just the internet. So you want to segregate data and information throughout the network based on that inventory. Was that more expensive to do? Yes. Is it more of a hassle for the organization? Yes. You don't want to do it willy-nilly, but in that case where the risk around medical records was so high, it was important to take those steps. You want to make sure that you're aware of who has access to sensitive data and remotely, and restrict or remove that access as much as possible. And once again, I haven't really talked about this as much so far, but oftentimes IT security policy isn't as much about a financial investment on the part of the organization as it is I don't know, it's not really an investment, but the hassle that you're creating for your staff. And I think this is particularly true for executive staff or senior leadership who feel like they need access to all of the information in the organization all the time in order to be able to do their work, and want to be able to access it from their personal devices, from mobile devices. There need to be limits, around those devices. Can be hard to control, and just because someone wants access to it doesn't mean that they should have access to it. And once again, this is where the policy becomes very, very helpful. If you have turnover in your executive leadership and you have a new ED come in and they are different from the previous ED and they want access to all of this information, you can, if you have a written policy, you can take it to them and say, look, our policy does not allow us to provide you with access to this information. Do you want us to change the policy? I don't know. In some cases, you might, want to require board approval for that, depending on the level of risk and the type of information. But once again, having it written down as a policy makes it a lot easier to control the information and access to the information. And finally, you really don't know whether or not your information remains confidential unless you're logging and monitoring the access to that information. And that can be kind of a bear because you don't really have the budget, especially smaller organizations, to um, you don't really have the budget to go out and hire someone full time to sit and look at security logs all day. And this is an area where I really hope the industry starts to catch up with the reality of the threat landscape in 2015, and there would be more sort of managed security services that provide. Like right now, antivirus is completely reactionary. It's definition based. It can respond to threats as it sees them, but it doesn't. It's unable to sort of do predictive response. Systems like the one Target had by FireEye are very effective in logging and monitoring and providing sort of a predictive response to threats, but they're $30-40 million. So this is an area where I hope the industry sort of catches up. Integrity, as much as I maybe have been maligning antivirus and anti-malware, still very important to have effective antivirus and anti-malware systems. You can maintain the integrity of your data by restricting permission and access to it as much as possible. Would recommend hardening servers, which just means setting up a server out of the box, so to speak, or setting up any information system really out of the box. And this was one of the unfortunate lessons of the iCloud hack. Don't assume that the iPhone that you bring home from the Apple Store is as secure as it could possibly be. And with most systems, you have to take extra steps to really secure the system. So hardening is an important process. For particularly sensitive data, we'd recommend scanning for vulnerabilities on a regular schedule. And then physical security, very important. Locking the doors, installing fire alarms is an important step to take. And finally, availability. You got to identify the availability requirements. This is just an absolute must, and I would identify it within a range. So how long can your email be down? If never is really your answer, if email can never ever be down, there are systems that can provide you with that, but they're very expensive. Now, fortunately, in this day and age, Office 365, especially in the last year, has had really good uptime metrics. And so that's actually an easy, especially for nonprofits, easy, almost cost-free way of getting that level of availability. But what about if you're hosting your financial accounting system on site? If you say it can never ever be down, then you're going to have to invest in a pretty complicated and expensive availability system. So it's important to be realistic about this and realize that the greater your availability, the more expensive it's going to be. And so again, like the CIA framework can provide a good starting point for identifying the availability requirements of your different systems. And you want to invest appropriately. Um, Make sure you understand, again, like if you do have a system that absolutely has to be available at all times, then the organization has to invest in that. Backups are important. It's important to think of backups within the context of availability. So it's not just about like making sure the backup is running, but make sure you have a good understanding of how long it takes to restore service. If your server crashes, how many hours are you down while the backup, while you're restoring from backup? Um, at what point can you go back to? How much data might be lost if you have to restore from backup? So it's important to understand those things, and strongly encourage, after many, many years of working with this, strongly encourage you all to keep it simple. This was Peter's. Uh, Keep it simple. Uh, Backups need to be as simple as possible. You need to monitor them on a regular basis. And I've seen people get very fancy and complicated with backup systems in order to save money. And they kind of combine a variety of different backup systems. And at the end of the day, it never works out because it always turns out that like one backup system was running, but another one wasn't. Or one backup system was backing up to another place, but then the other place's backup system wasn't running and all of the data was lost. So as much as possible, strongly recommend backing up all data to a single system, um, if at all possible, to the extent that that fits in with the CIA inventory. Um, Keeping extra hardware on hand can be necessary, particularly for like laptops and workstations. Um, there will come a point in time if you have, I would say, at least 30 staff or more, just percentage wise, you're gonna have a workstation or a laptop crash on you at some point. And while it's crashed, your staff person is not going to have anything to work on while it gets repaired. So it might be worth having a spare computer that they can use if and when that happens. So, but again, that just kind of depends on the availability requirements of the organization. And I'd encourage developing a business continuity plan. A lot of boards require this, and be sure to incorporate and include your IT department and their policies on the business continuity plan. So we've talked a lot now about the IT department. That's important, but it's also important to come up with a policy for the end user, the staff in your organization who are using the information. And there's kind of four things that I want to talk about. One, security culture and end user training. Doesn't even really seem like a policy issue, but it is. And in fact, contrary almost to what I said before about making sure everything is in writing, I think you can sort of make the opposite mistake. The big mistake I think that gets made with IT department policies is not writing enough down, not documenting enough. The big mistake that gets made with end user policies is relying too much on written policy to, sort of guide how end users are acting and behaving, if you will. So it's important to foster a security culture. And you can have a policy that describes how you do this, that states the importance of doing this, but I think you also have to live it out. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. Talk a little bit about password policy. This is something that you want to have in writing because it can be controversial, although the landscape has really changed when it comes to password policies. We'll talk a little bit about BYOD policy. And then finally, yes, you want a written appropriate use policy. Your legal department certainly wants you to have a written appropriate use policy that says that you own the data, you own the computers, you're free to monitor or access any of the data or information on those machines. You want to make sure your employees sign that when they start working for the organization. That's all important. Not to say that that's not important, but there's hundreds of examples of that type of document, and the kind of IT policy that we're talking about here is much more sort of sophisticated and comprehensive than just that. So security culture. How do you establish security culture? Well, you want to train your staff. You want to make sure they're aware of the risks that are out there, and you can make it fun. You don't. It doesn't have to be a long, sort of boring presentation. So I would ask them this question: if Vladimir Putin gave you a USB charger, would you use it? And this is a real life example. When Russia hosted the G20 last year, all of the delegates were given, swag bag. We all get them at conferences that we go to. And one of the delegates from Belgium took this battery charger back to his IT department and gave it to him, and they kind of picked it apart and looked at it, and they were like, "Yeah, this has a payload, a spyware payload basically. So you plug this into your computer, you plug it into your phone, and it tries to deliver some malware that will start, basically spying on the computer for you." So use common sense. Don't just trust the Wi-Fi network in the cafe that you've gone to. Don't trust all of the swag that you get at the conferences that you go to. Clearly, like if you were going to Russia and you got something that looked like this, it might be cause for concern, as it clearly was for the delegates from Belgium. So anyhow, I would just find ways to kind of alert staff to the security threats that they face and that the organization faces. But do it in a way that's fun. User awareness, that's the best defense. All of these other policies are fine and important, but if you're not training your users and your staff on how to keep their information secure, you're not securing the most vulnerable vector into the organization, if you will. So user awareness is important. I, would strongly recommend training. Would make it mandatory, but as much as possible, try to make it fun. It should also be ongoing. Like you could use the Celebrity iCloud, which is kind of a tasty example that people are probably interested in. It involves celebrities. It involves Apple. Who's going to turn that down? And just use something like that. Make a short 10, 15-minute presentation to kind of remind staff about the importance of secure passwords, the importance of hardening their devices, being careful with what they take pictures of on their devices, and so on and so forth. And it really needs to be embraced by all staff. It can't just be the IT department, and it definitely should be the IT department. Generally, there was a study that was done that they found that the IT department is really more guilty of violating best security practices than any other department in most organizations. So it's important that everyone from senior leadership to the IT department is held accountable, to security training and being a good security citizen. Let's talk a little bit about passwords. It's really important to have a good password policy. This is something that is I've found to be incredibly controversial over the years. And it's kind of sad because organizations can invest in firewalls and expensive antivirus, and they can write all these policies and do all this training. And then if their users don't have secure passwords, there's really kind of no point to doing any of those other things. So some questions. Should passwords be changed regularly? Yes. Although the conventional wisdom is changing on that. I'll talk about that in a second. Can they be complex enough to be secure? For a time, people thought, let's make the passwords 6 characters, then 7 characters, then 8 characters. Now it's 10 characters. The problem is the character length has to do with how easy it is to crack the password, and that has to do with how much processing power the hackers have available to them. And because of Moore's law, processing power doubles every year, and so the ability to crack longer and longer passwords continues to grow as well. So the conventional wisdom now may be that maybe complex passwords aren't enough to be secure. And then obviously with the growth of information systems, what's to prevent someone at your organization from using the password that they use on your network as the same password that they use on their Facebook account, as the same password that they use on Yahoo, the same password that they use on Dropbox. If they're using the same password in all those different places and just one of those, cloud services gets hacked, now the passwords into your organization are not only known to the hacker that did the breach, but generally what happens these days is, usually when there's that kind of a hack, those passwords are all dumped, into the dark net. And now there's an additional set of, a dictionary file basically. So you may have some crazy amazing password that you're really proud of. It's 12 characters long and it's a random string and you've managed to memorize it. And you're like, there's no way that this is going to get cracked, through brute force attack. That may be true, but if you're using that password on Dropbox, Dropbox gets hacked. Now that password makes it into, the darknet dictionary file, and basically that's going to get checked first when someone's trying to hack into your system and your other accounts. And you know, it's it's that's a really easily hacked password. So while while it is, for Active Directory at least, it's important to change passwords regularly. While it's important to have complex passwords, uh, there's a growing sense that some of our conventional wisdom around good passwords is being challenged, by the cloud and by increasing computer power. So what we're really seeing is a move towards password management. And this is probably an interim step. I mean, I think, the hope is that maybe someday we get to something like biometrics as being maybe the best way to validate identity and, authenticate access. But for now, we're really moving towards password managers as being kind of the best way to, manage all of these mitigating factors around passwords. So password manager systems, I've got some examples here at the bottom of the slide, some personal ones. Actually, LastPass, I think they have nonprofit pricing. LastPass is an individual password manager, but it's one that can be deployed at an organization. So you can sign up for a LastPass account and have, 10 accounts or 20 or 30, however many staff you have. And they can use it to manage all of the passwords they use to access. So the person in accounting who needs to log into Razor's Edge, they also need to log into QuickBooks online, and they need to log into ADP to do payroll. All of those passwords can be made incredibly secure. They can be 20 characters long, completely random string of characters. They can all be stored in LastPass. And then the other nice thing about that is that if the person leaves the organization, you have, it's all those passwords are being stored in an information system that the organization owns. So LastPass, 1Password is more of a personal one. Individuals can use it, although they do have business licensing packages. It's a little bit more device-based, and I think it works particularly well with iPhones, iPads, and Macs. Secret Server and Auth Anvil are also organization-based password management systems that are a little more advanced and sophisticated than LastPass and 1Password. But basically, these systems, I'm kind of working my way backwards through this slide, but these systems basically generate really good passwords and manage them for you. Some of the best ones will warn you if you're connecting to a system that's had a breach, and will ask you to change your password. So we're starting to look more and more at using password management as a way of replacing kind of the conventional wisdom password policies. One other thing you can add is dual factor authentication. And those of you who've been in the IT world for a while may remember them as this little, dongle down here, this thumb device at the bottom of the slide. But two-factor is essentially something you know and something you have. So the something you know is your password, and the something you have is a device that only you have. And so really secure systems, even if someone steals your password, if they don't have the dongle that generates the code, they're not going to be able to log in. And nowadays, we all have a device on our person that no one else has. It's our smartphone. And so Google Authenticator, Google has really led the way with their Authenticator app, which is available for Android and iPhone. And a lot of systems are now standardizing around Google Authenticator, although Microsoft is building one that I think they've released, Microsoft Account. And it's just a question of what services will start to use that system. A number of services will use SMS or text messages for the two-factor, and a huge number of online services from Facebook to Twitter to Evernote to Dropbox to Microsoft Live all have the ability to set up two-factor, and we strongly recommend doing that and making it a device two-factor. Talk briefly about BYOD. We've done a number of webinars on BYOD in the past. Those are available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. There's not much new here, but just to kind of close the loop, BYOD stands for Bring Your Own Device. And again, if we apply our CIA triad to BYOD, we're concerned about data leakage, so information getting on personal devices and leaking out of the company and creating a confidentiality problem. Integrity, those devices can be used as a vector into the company. This is particularly true for Dropbox, where someone might have Dropbox installed on their work computer as well as on their home computer. So now they're, in a virtual sort of way, bringing their home device onto the corporate network. And then availability, there's as more malware and targeted hacking, it creates more opportunity for targeted hacking into the network. Some additional risks to think about as you're putting your BYOD policy together. Legislated law is thin. There's really virtually no legislation around how to handle BYOD. Case law is uncertain. It's growing every year, but there hasn't been a lot of cases yet to sort of establish case law around BYOD. One example that is interesting is if you let employees access their work email from their personal device, but they're exempt staff, in other words, they're hourly staff, if they're checking and working on email from home, does that means you have to pay them, overtime? You have to somehow you can't, it's a violation of labor laws basically to have them working without compensation after hours. So that's a tricky issue that you want to give a lot of serious thought to before you give employees access to email on their personal devices, for example, or other work information. Also, and again, this is where the lack of certainty, the lack of legal certainty creates problems. But you want to, personal devices and data could be subpoenaed. So if you're involved in litigation and there's information on your laptop or on your phone, if that's corporate information, it can be subpoenaed and you have to give up your device. There are financial risks around BYOD. Stipends might cost more. IT support can become entangled with supporting those devices. Like I said before, exempt staff need to be paid, and managing all those devices, those systems can be expensive. So you want to ask yourself these questions. What level of access is provided to staff? What level of support is provided and for which staff? And should devices be managed and controlled and for which staff? How do you answer these questions? Once again, CIA inventory can be very helpful. You can look at your information. You can evaluate it. This is straight from the previous slide. You can evaluate it based on the CIA framework. And from there, you can make a granular policy. Medical records, no access from personal devices. Donor contacts and financial system, those will be accessed through a published app, but no data will be allowed to leave the organization. Program management data for this organization, not a high risk, will allow BYOD. So that brings me to the end of the webinar. We have 2 minutes left, so let me wrap up here with a few final slides, tell you about our next webinar next month, and then I'll be available. I'll stay online for another 10 or 15 minutes and answer any questions that folks have. So if I can leave you with one thing, it's write it down. It doesn't need to be a work of art, but as you think about IT security and come up with policies, make those decisions and agree upon, the value and the risk associated with different data in your organization, be sure to write it down. All right, so our next webinar, our webinar series continues next month. It'll be on the third Thursday, May 21st. And we are going to have a very exciting Microsoft Ignite recap by our Chief Technology Officer, Matthew Eshelman, and our Director IT Consulting, Steve Longenecker. They are going to the week-long Microsoft Ignite conference in Chicago. It's the first week in May, and they're going to have an hour-long webinar at the end of May to kind of tell us what they learned. I'm really excited to hear about it. Microsoft has really turned around in the last 18 months or so which is great news for the nonprofit sector. Microsoft has always been one of the biggest sort of champions and supporters of nonprofits over the years, and a strong and growing Microsoft is really good news for nonprofit organizations. So there are a lot of exciting things happening coming out of Microsoft right now. Windows 10 is coming. SharePoint Online continues to grow, to gain traction as part of the Office 365 offering. Skype for Business just came out last week. What is that going to mean for nonprofits? Yammer is a new collaboration service that Microsoft is rolling out with Office 365. A lot of interesting things happening with Microsoft, and Matt and Steve are going to be there for the whole week along with 15,000 other people to check it out, and they're going to be sharing all of that with us, so you're not going to want to miss that. As always, after the webinar, please feel free to connect with us on social media. We will be sending you a link to a short survey. We love doing these webinars, and we really rely on your feedback to improve them. We think of this as a service to the nonprofit sector, and we want to continue to improve them. So please fill out the survey and let us know what you think. If you missed anything, I know I skipped through some of those slides at the end there pretty quickly. Our slides are on SlideShare, and the recording of this webinar is going to be on our YouTube channel. Links to both of those are on our website and will be emailed to you after the webinar is over. Thank you all for your patience and your time today. Really appreciate it. And as I mentioned, I've got time to answer a few questions. So feel free to use the question tool to ask those, and I will do my best. So let's see here. Having a little bit of technical difficulties with the Q&A. Okay. All right. Whoops. All right. Let's see here. I think we touched on most of these. Yeah. Okay. In a small organization, is there a recommendation for who should be the IT watchdog if there is not dedicated staff? I mean, I think in a small organization, I would say that it should probably be the person who's responsible for IT. And for better or for worse, that responsibility does need to reside with somebody. Just as like a really small organization, like 5, 6 people, somebody has to be responsible for HR. Making sure that benefits, are being handled. Generally, a lot of that will get outsourced to a benefits firm, but there still needs to be someone who's responsible for it. So I would say that ultimately, whoever's in a really small organization, whoever's responsible for IT is also the person who should be responsible for, who should kind of play that IT watchdog service. How does a small organization enforce mobile device policies? That's a great question. As I mentioned in one of the slides earlier, those mobile device policies can be pretty expensive. Microsoft, interestingly enough, has a number of tools that are included with Office 365. So if you're using Exchange Online, you actually already have at your disposal a few tools that can be used to monitor the devices and wipe them if you need to. And Microsoft is actually rolling out, they acquired a firm called Intune, and they're rolling out a set of mobile device management tools as part of their Office 365 offering. For for-profit organizations, this is an additional payment. It's an additional add-on service, and I don't think we know yet whether it's something that will be offered no charge to nonprofit organizations. Let's see here. I think that just about covers it. So if there are no more questions, oh wait, we got one more here. What checks and balances can you put in place to keep the IT person slash staff slash consultant honest? Great question. And this is actually the amazing part of the question, in parentheses, analogous to financial controls. Um, that's a great question, and I think that sort of that last comment there really highlights the challenge that we all face in the world of IT, which is, you know, checks and balances in financial accounting systems. Those have been developed over the centuries, really. And now we have a really mature set of practices in financial accounting that organizations are required to follow. And because of the newness of IT, we don't have that same sort of system or checks and balances set up. So, um, I think to me that this is really a governance question, and you could really use the financial control system as a starting point if you have those processes already in place and you're using them to manage sort of access to the financial systems. You could see if there's something, if you could kind of tack the IT onto those processes. But basically, I think restricting access is the first place to start. Um, and in some degrees, like building trust with the people that are have access to the IT systems is a critical part of that as well. All right. Oh, get one more. So is there a concern using LastPass as it only requires one password to get access to all of the passwords for a user? Great question. That's actually true of any password management system. I don't know if I think LastPass now offers two-factor. So that's an important step that you can take. The system that we use here at Community IT to manage our passwords requires two-factor. So that's one requirement. I know 1Password. Their sort of spiel is make your the name of the program comes from their pitch, which is from now on you only have to know one password. Now you want to follow good password practices and make that password as long and secure as possible, but don't ever change it. You now only have one password that you have to learn. I think the other thing that I would add about LastPass is that their existence as a business and as a company depends on that information being secure and those passwords not being hacked. And so they have a much greater set of incentives around keeping that password secure and making it difficult to crack that password than you know your bank. Sadly, uh, you know, maybe the bank isn't a good example, but certainly Target as a retailer doesn't think of itself as an information systems provider, and so the business organization and operations weren't in place to the same extent that they would be at a place like LastPass. So um, I think while there is some concern that if that password were ever hacked, they'd have access to all of the passwords. Um, I think the benefit of what LastPass provides in terms of securing all of your other systems outweighs the risk that comes from potentially losing that one password. Great. Well, thank you all. Appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you next month for the Microsoft Ignite webinar. Have a great afternoon. Take care.